All right, hopefully everyone can hear me. This is Jason Straight here with the Cloud Virtual Chapter. I know we're supposed to be starting here in about a minute, but between now and then, I'm going to do some quick community news and then let Michael take over with his presentation tonight. So the main things I just want to talk about real quick is stuff going on with PASS, and some of the main things that are coming up is in the next couple months we will be having the elections for the PASS Board of Directors. You do need to be an eligible member in order to vote, so make sure that you do have your PASS profile updated. For most of us, this should be okay, but if you're new to PASS in the last couple of years, you're going to want to make sure that gets taken care of. I'd tell you to register for the BA conference, but that just wrapped up today, so we can just skip right on over that. And the main thing that I just wanted to mention is we've got this virtual chapter and many others here at PASS, and it's basically people in the community that are getting together to talk about specific topics, whether it's specific aspects of technology, specific platforms, or groups that like to work together. Whether it's a Chinese chapter, the cloud chapter that we have here, Women in Technology. Apparently there's a Saturday night SQL virtual chapter, which I'm going to probably check out because I have such an exciting social life. So we've got all those types of chapters available, and these chapters provide lots of different topics. Like tonight we're going to be talking, well, tonight for me, we're going to be talking about Azure SQL Database, and then next week we'll be talking about SQL Data Warehouse. With the PASS cloud chapter, I do plan on trying to pick this up a little bit and make it have us meet a little bit more regularly. So between now and the next 8 weeks, I think I've got 8 different presentations scheduled for Mondays and Wednesdays at either 7 p.m. Central or 8 p.m. Central. With that, I'm actually going to pass things and hand it over to Mike and let him kick off. And if I can remember how to make him a presenter, there we go. There you go, Mike. It is all for you now.
Hurrah. Okay. Are you able to see my slide deck?
Yep, I can see it. I'm assuming everyone else can.
All right. If you can see it, I'm going to assume that everyone else can. So yes, good evening, good afternoon, or even if you're here from way in Europe, good morning. Welcome, and thanks for coming out to spend a little of your time. Listen to us talk about Azure SQL Databases, something I've gotten into recently, and it's actually pretty cool. If you had asked me, like even a year ago, if I would have liked or thought about going to Azure SQL Database, I would have said no. But what I've worked with in the past 3 to 6 months, this has really turned into a really cool technology. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll see why I think it's a really cool technology. With that, we'll cover quickly the obligatory bio slide, just so you know who I am. My name is Mike Fal. I am a SQL Server DBA and a consultant currently for Upsearch. Upsearch is a professional services SQL Server consulting firm, and we do SQL Server work. If you need a hand with that and you're curious about how we might be able to help you, let me know. Some stuff about me: I blog at mikefal.net, and I tend to blog about SQL Server and PowerShell. In fact, the past few blog posts I've put up are on Azure SQL Database and managing it with PowerShell, which we're going to see some of tonight. I am a Microsoft Certified Solutions Expert for the data platform, and I am an Adara Ace. And basically, this is Adara has an awards program to recognize folks in the community, and they were kind enough to recognize me for this year. So they're just trying to get some support out for the community, and they are using me as a platform for that. That's all that we're going to talk about there. So tonight, what we're going to cover is just some basic stuff here. So what is Azure SQL Database? I mean, there's a lot in that question. There's a lot to cover, a fair amount of detail. When we start getting into what Azure SQL Database is, there's several components, and we're going to talk about those. And they somewhat relate to your typical on-premise installation of SQL Server. There's some similarities, there's some differences, and we're going to talk about those two, how those two things relate, how the Azure SQL Database in the cloud can is similar and is different from the on-premise product. And then finally, how do we use it? How can we manage things, create tables, create objects, query stuff? How is this the same? How is this different from Azure SQL Database? Now, as with any of my presentations, I'm always willing to answer questions. Now, obviously, within a webinar, it makes it a little weird, but Jason, I'm assuming you're going to field questions?
Yep, I'll be doing that.
Okay, so yeah, feel free to hit Jason up with questions, and I'll make sure I pause throughout the presentation to see that those questions get answered. All right, let's dive in then. So what is Azure SQL Database? Well, there's this, you might have heard of this term PaaS, or Platform as a Service. As we move into the world of the cloud and all these, you get all these acronyms, right? It's just like any other new technology that we start to get all sorts of new acronyms and phrases and catch terms and all this stuff. And the thing is with the cloud, we're starting to get a lot of things as a service. Now, there are different layers of this. There's infrastructure as a service, which offers you just virtual machines. There's platform as a service, which offers you applications running in the cloud. And there's others. You've probably heard of software as a service, SaaS, and similar acronyms. But for our purposes, we want to focus on platform as a service. And that's what the Azure SQL Database really is. Microsoft is offering you a version of a database. They're giving you the database to use as a service. So you don't have to worry about all the other stuff around it. We're going to talk about specifically what that means. But offering you this database as a service, so where you can pay a monthly fee to make use of the database and not pay it when you don't need it. Something like a utility. Now, when we start talking about specifically Azure SQL Database, so first off, it's a hosted solution, right? You're not going to put this on your own hardware. You're not going to put this anywhere within your own server farm if you have an on-premise or co-located server farm. So that's going to be hosted. And this means Microsoft handles all the infrastructure behind it. You don't have to worry about the servers or the network or any of that. It's all part of Microsoft's Azure platform. It is sort of like SQL Server, but not quite. And we're going to get into the specifics here. But from a high level, we need to understand that Azure SQL Database is its own thing. It doesn't directly relate. It's not like, oh, this is SQL 2016 or this is SQL 2014 or some version of it. It's Azure SQL Database. It's its own thing. Now, it shares a lot of the features of the on-premise or the out-of-the-box product. And like I said, we're going to talk about that. We're going to see some specifics there. What's cool is because it's a service from Microsoft, they can roll features out to it whenever they want. So you're actually going to get some newer features that are coming in the product before it actually shows up in the on-box product. What this also means is kind of a testing ground. It's a way for Microsoft to say, hey, we've got this cool feature, we've vetted it out, we think it's going to be awesome, and they can put it into Azure SQL Database before it actually, to test it out, make sure it works all right. So with that in mind, what it means is having a service, it means there are some things we don't have to worry about, that we no longer concern ourselves with. Like I said, since this is a platform, since Microsoft has the infrastructure, they handle all the updates to the infrastructure. We don't have to worry anymore about patching our servers. We don't have to worry about patching SQL. This is all handled by Microsoft, and they actually do it in such a way that we don't have to experience any downtime while they do this. They just update it for us, meaning we're always on the current version of whatever we need, and we always have the current security fixes. It also means we no longer have to worry about hardware pain, running into a memory limit, running into disk space limits. Maybe we have a drive go bad. I'm sure many of us have been in those situations where, hey, we've had to fight the hardware at some point. Well, because Microsoft hosts this on their own infrastructure, They're handling all that behind the scenes for us. We no longer have to worry about that. This one sometimes makes DBAs a little uncomfortable. We no longer have to worry about backups with this hosted solution. Microsoft takes care of backing up the Azure SQL Database for us and making it available for recovery purposes. We don't have to set up the log backups. And when we have to restore, we don't have to worry about managing, okay, what backup file we need, how do we get that all organized. And we're going to see that in practical application. But this is kind of a handy way for, as a service, we don't have to, it takes a lot of that headache away from us of having to manage the backups. And also, what I think is very handy is the backups are there automatically. We've all been in that situation where we set up a database and we thought we set up the backups, or somebody else created a database but they didn't set up the backups. They forgot that. And so what we end up coming to is hey, we have a database that isn't getting backed up, and that could really cause us some headache, particularly if something goes wrong with that database. Because it's a service and because Microsoft builds this into the platform, we can create a database and know that it's going to be getting backed up by Microsoft and by the platform, and we don't have to worry about, oh, somebody forgot to set up a script or something. Another thing is we don't have to worry about running out of space, and I do put sort of here. We're going to see this as we get into more about what the Azure SQL Database is and how it functions. But what's cool is because Microsoft handles the whole infrastructure, we don't have to track the disk space. We don't have to sit here and go, okay, are we allocating enough drive space for this stuff? Do we have to order more storage? Do we have to manage all that? That's all part of Microsoft. We have to select a service level, which then defines how much storage we get. And again, we're going to talk about that more in detail. But for the most part, that's another piece of the pain that's taken away from us, all because Azure SQL Database is offered to us as a service. With that in mind, so we talked about what we don't have or what we don't need to worry about. So what do we get? And there's several components to the whole Azure SQL Database setup. And if you're familiar with SQL Server, a lot of these are going to be, you're going to see a lot of parallels here. When they created the Azure SQL Database offering, they obviously were keeping some of the things in mind of how it operates on-premise, and it makes sense of how it all comes together. One of these is we're going to have a server. When we create an Azure SQL Database up in our Azure subscription, we're going to get what's called a server. Now, this isn't really a box that they give you and say, here, you're the only one who gets this. This is kind of a logical representation of a server. It's a container. It gets a name, and this is important because we're going to give it a name of whatever we want, but it's going to have appended to it database.windows.net, and that's how we're going to connect to it. It's basically a URL, and again, we're going to see this when we dive into the actual demonstration. But we're going to have this server with a name. We have to select a version, and that's either 11 or 12. And again, this doesn't relate to SQL 2014 or SQL 2016. It's its own version, and 12 is the most current. If you want to draw a parallel, it's probably closest to 2016, but again, there are differences. Now, we also have logins to this. If you're familiar with SQL Server, again, you got this idea of logins and users, logins that get you into the server and users that are within the database. And we have a similar thing here. The trick is while we can do Windows authentication with most of our on-premise stuff, the only way we can do Windows authentication with Azure SQL Database is Azure AD. Right now, though, for the most part, it's SQL only. So you pretty much are going to be using SQL logins for your databases. Not really a big deal, but just something to be aware of. Now, so this gives us our container to put our databases into. And we're going to see how this all connects in the demo. But within this server, then we get a database. Now, this database is where we put all our tables and our store procedures and our views and whatnot. This is the actual database, and it lives within the server. We give it a name, and we're going to select a service level. We're going to see what that service level means in the next few slides. And then we select an edition, and there's a couple different editions, but this isn't, again, the same as the on-premise where you have a standard edition and you have a web edition and you have an enterprise edition. With Azure SQL Database, I believe it's standard edition, you have a premium edition, There is a web edition. So there are various different edition levels, and it has to do, again, with all the features that you need. Now the thing is because we have one database here in this server, we can have other databases. So we can have multiple databases living in a server. Just think of the server as a container, and we can have however many databases of whatever different sizes within that server. Now once we have this in place, we have to talk about how to access it, right? And there's some security in place. Now because it's Azure, it's living basically on the internet, right? It's living in Microsoft's own data centers somewhere in the world as their cloud. But to get to it, we have to go through the internet. And this means we want to secure things. In order to secure things, we have a couple options. One is we can create a server level firewall. So this is unique to the Azure SQL Database, to where we can control access to the server as a whole, declaring IP addresses and allowing access through those IP addresses to our server. And this means that we can really lock down the access to stuff. You're going to see when we do the demos, I'm going to be creating an Azure SQL database, but because of my firewall rules, none of you guys will be able to connect to it because you're not going to be doing it from my IP address. Maybe if you spoof it, sure, but no, that's a lot more complex than we're going to get into today. Anyway, we have a server firewall to help lock things down. We can also have a database firewall in addition to this. So while the server firewall will allow us to create access rules for all the databases in our server, we can create database-specific access rules using the firewall. So we can go directly to an individual database, and we can basically say, okay, this IP or this group of IPs can go to this database but can't go to any of the others. And it gives us a lot of security. Now what we get then here on top of this is we have, how do we get at it? We have a couple different ways, right? So we can either come at these databases from Azure, or we can come at it from some sort of machine out in the wild, whether it's in our co-located facility, whether it's on our desktop, what have you. You can have two different routes into your databases. Now the Azure one, there's some special firewall rules around that to make it easier because they would like you to keep everything contained within the Azure platform. But these aren't difficult at all to set up your firewall rules for the on-premise stuff. Next up, so we have these databases, and we mentioned service level. So you're probably asking at this point, well, how do I know how big my database is, or how well does it perform, or any of these sort of factors here of how do we define the database operational state. And that's where these service levels come into play. When you create a database, you have to select a service level. And the service level basically defines the kind of features you have and the kind of workload you can support. And you'll see on this chart how this fairly easily breaks out. When we create a database, we can select one of three larger tiers, whether it's basic, standard, or premium. And the standard, the basic, you only get a 2 GB database. It's basically like SQL Express. Standard gives you up to 250 gigs of a database, and premium can be 500 or 1 terabyte. So you can have some fairly significantly sized databases up here in Azure. Now obviously you can have a larger than, on-premise you can easily have larger than 1 terabyte databases, but for most use cases, these sizes are going to get you a lot of mileage. Now the next thing you're going to see here is these DTUs. These are called database transaction units, and this is one of these funny, I want to say somewhat ambiguous metrics that you're going to run into in the cloud. A lot of times you go to the different cloud providers like in Azure and AWS, and they will measure performance. They want to capture all the different types of performance metrics that you can have and boil it down in like one number. And that's what Microsoft has tried to do with these database transaction units. What these essentially mean, or what they're supposed to mean, is approximately how many transactions per second the database can support. So whether it's 10 transactions per second, 20, 50. The thing is, though, is there's a lot of, that's a very rough description of it, and even Microsoft will say if you want the full,
detail of what DTUs mean. They have this whole white paper on it. For the most part, I just use it as a, if you're going to hold your thumb up and judge something, this is what DTUs are. They're kind of a rough judgment of how much or how quickly your database will perform. Really what I recommend to people for when they're trying to choose the appropriate database size is to look at the rest of this stuff. So it's about features. For example, do you need point-in-time restore? We talk about point-in-time restore and how Microsoft now, because it's a service, they're going to handle the backups. Well, they're going to handle it only to a certain point, and if you select basic, you can only restore to a point in time in the last 7 days. If you have standard, 14, and premium, the last 35 days, basically the last month. So one question you're going to have to ask yourself if you're choosing one of these service levels is, how far back in time am I going to have to restore? And that's going to define one of these that you select. Disaster recovery. So by default, your database is going to be just located in one region. Depending on your service level, you can say, oh, well, standard geo-replication means we can replicate it to another region. It's just offline there. It's essentially database mirroring if we look at it. Premium starts to act more like availability groups where you have active geo-replication. You can have multiple readable secondaries in other regions and just have your read-write in one region. You need to consider that, though, when you're selecting your service tier as to what this is going to be. And then we have other things like in-memory OLTP is supported by Azure SQL Database, concurrent requests, concurrent logins, max sessions. These are all things you're going to consider when you start to select your service level.
Okay, Michael, I've got a couple questions for you.
Sure, I was actually just about to stop to ask you for that. What's up?
Cool. So one of the questions that came through is, since Microsoft is handling the backups, how do you handle the restores or testing of restores? How does that work?
So that's a great question. That's going to be answered in the demos. I'm going to show you exactly how you can restore a database and manage that restore. So let's hold on to that one until later on in the session.
Okay, and then we got two more here that are good for right now. Can you have one database that's up to 1 terabyte with additional 1 terabyte NDF files associated with it?
No. So because this is a database as a service, we don't get any sort of access or exposure to the files underneath, and we can't add additional files to an Azure SQL database. What you would need to do is just create another database and have basically a federated database set up. And there's that's a funky term that people will hear from time to time. You might have also heard of sharding, right? Having a database schema that's broken out logically across multiple databases in shards. And these are the kind of patterns that start to come into play when you start using Azure SQL Database for stuff. Because we can't say, well, let's just take this one database and we're going to make it an additional terabyte. We can't do that. All we're allowed to do is basically buy the off-the-shelf product that Microsoft is offering us and say, well, we'll spin up another terabyte database and deploy the schema. Now, to be honest, if you have a database that's larger than 1 terabyte and you're looking to put it into the cloud like this, you're going to need to make a lot of engineering considerations around it. Most of your scenarios for using Azure SQL Database are going to be for databases that are smaller than 1 terabyte. As you get that to that scale, it's not that it can't be done, but there is some engineering that needs to be done around that, and I think you would have to do that engineering regardless.
Right.
There was another question?
Yep, there's one more question, and then one thing just to add on to your last answer is that we will be, with that federation or the Elastic database, we have a presentation coming up on that we just got locked in for like 3 weeks from now.
Excellent. So there you go.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess that's early.
Yeah, it's going to be Valancourt.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So the last question for right now is how do you measure and monitor active DTUs being used?
I'm going to say I honestly, I don't know if there's a way to measure that. Jason, do you know if there's a way to measure that?
Yeah, on the dashboard for the Azure portal, you can get to it within there under SQL, under your databases. It's got some historical measurements, and then you can also use PowerShell to pull that information out.
Yes, so I know which way I would do it.
Yep.
So yes, there's the way that you would measure that. All right, and I guess that's it for the questions. I'm sorry.
Yep, that's it for now.
So with that, let's actually dive into a bit of a demo here. So the first thing I wanted to start off with is we're going to look a little bit at the portal. If I can get my, come here, browser. So for those of you who have not seen it, we're in the Microsoft Azure portal, which you can get to at portal.azure.com. And then within this, we have different resource groups. Now, as a quick highlight, there have been two ways to deploy Azure SQL Databases over the years. Actually, I should say over the last year. Traditionally, you have what's called this classic deployment methodology, which will create Azure SQL Databases as standalone objects within the Azure environment. Excuse me. Now, what I'm going to show you tonight is what's called the resource group deployment model, or the resource manager deployment model, where the idea is you create these resource groups, and those are larger containers that house all the objects that you want to put into that resource group. So in this case, we have my general list of resource groups. If I wanted to create a database, and we can just show a bit of it here, where I go into like the test resource group, and it loads up, and we can then add a resource into here for the Azure SQL Database. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest, this is way more clicking than I want to do. And I can go and click through the entire interface to show you how it's created, but I'd much rather bring up my PowerShell script for this. So I have this PowerShell script here, and this is going to be available with the slide deck for download. So you guys can get at this and take a view of what's going on here. But I'm going to load up a couple different things, a couple different modules to make Azure SQL Database work for us. And then I have a script that I'm using to load a CSV later on. Now, one of the things about using Azure and using this resource deployment model that annoys me a little bit is, so we have to log into our Azure account. We have to give it some sort of credentials to do all our work under. And to do this, we would call Azure RM, login Azure RM account. Now, when I run this, unfortunately, it brings up a GUI. And for me, who am like, hey, PowerShell should be all about automation, we have to use this GUI to log in. So I'm going to log in here because I'm using my Microsoft account. So we're going to log in. Oh, and I should not fat finger my password. I should not fat finger my password a second time. There we go. So this logs us in, and now we have authority to create objects. Now I'm going to set a few things here. Again, please feel free to download the script and parse it on your own. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. All I'm doing is setting some variables of what I'm going to call the resource group, the location, server name. I'm getting my local IP so I can create the firewall rules, and then I'm creating a credential to log into. So we'll just set those up. Now, creating a resource group is not a big deal. We're just going to say create new Azure RM resource group. And there it is. So I've created a resource group, and now I'm going to create a SQL server within that group. So we're going to create our Azure Database SQL Server. We need a resource group name, a location, the name of our server, and administrative credentials. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm creating an SA user for my server. Then I have to declare a server version, and I'm going to use 12.0 because it's the most current. So we're going to run that. And while that's running, it'll take a little bit. It shouldn't take too long. The next two commands here, as I said, we need to create firewall rules. Now, I told you we already retrieved my IP, so I'm going to create a firewall rule from my local IP address to the Azure SQL Database SQL Server I'm creating. But there's another one that we can create to say allow all Azure IPs. Now remember how I said they want you to try and put stuff into Azure? Microsoft's making it easy on you, saying, hey, if you want to create a firewall rule that allows all Azure services into it without having to worry about ports and IP addresses and all that, you can create a firewall rule and use the allow Azure IPs switch here, and this will create just an Azure IP, or it'll create one firewall rule that allows all Azure services. So we're going to run that, and that's creating my firewall rules. So we've created the server. Remember, this is the large logical container that's going to hold on to everything. Next up, I'm going to create an Azure RM. I'm going to use the Azure RM SQL Database commandlet, and I'm going to create a database itself. Create it with a resource group, a server name. I'm going to use just standard edition. Give it a database name, and I'm going to set my service level objective to S0, standard 0. So this is going to run and take a bit. Now while that's running, I want to pull the portal back up again here. And you can see kind of the output of what we've done here. As long as, see, this is the problem with giving presentations on the web, right? Is you're kind of at the mercy of your bandwidth. So that's still going, okay. Apologies, this is taking just a little bit longer than expected to load the portal up. Okay, well, so while that, we'll be able to look at the database while that's completed. So we have created the database. We've got some stuff output here of what the database is. You know, things like collation, max size, when it was created. All things we're used to seeing with the database. Wow, that is still, we'll hit a refresh there. So while that's still getting the portal up, I do want to move along. Okay, no. Yeah, while the portal's still running, I want to try and move this along. So I'm going to go ahead and create a quick SQL file. And then we're going to fire up Management Studio. And I'm going to connect to, remember I said that .database windows.net? So this is our server name. It's going to be the server name that we created at the top of the script, .database.windows.net. I'm going to connect to master just to simplify some things, and I am passing it my SQL login credentials. So let's go ahead and fire up Management Studio. Let's see, portal's still coming up. My poor little computer here doesn't seem to want to run to support this stuff. Okay, so while Management Studio is coming up, let me just verify that I did execute. No, I did execute that, so that should be. I'm gonna cheat a little bit and just open it up manually. So going back to the portal. Apologies for jumping around a little bit, but here's the resource group that we created, the Intro to Azure SQL. If I open this up, and it's going to do the blades, now we can see, hey, I've got my SQL Server here, the MSF SQL Intro, and the MSF SQL DB. And we can click on, we can go into the blade for the server and see some more details. So we've created all the resources. They're all available to us. Okay. Oh, looks like my Management Studio has opened up. Let me just pop back to this. All right, it's still loading. Anyway, I guess you can go through and you can explore all the stuff. Everything we've created will show up in the portal. Yeah, so it's coming up with one database, and we have various information around this. We can drill into it more more if we want to. But let's go to Management Studio because this is where I think most of us care about stuff. So looking at Management Studio, we do have we can see the URL that we've connected to and the database version. Now remember, this database version doesn't relate to database versions that we're used to. This is Azure SQL Database version. we can then browse, we have 2 nodes here, much like we would have in a normal Object Explorer. We'd have a bunch more, but just for Azure SQL Database, we have databases and we have security. Now you'll notice there's a system databases. There still exists the idea of a master database when you have these servers that holds your security information and other stuff, but you're not going to use it too much. And if we go into MSF, if we go into the database itself, we're going to start to see things that we're used to seeing. Tables, views, synonyms, programmability, a lot of stuff that we normally see in the Object Explorer. I'm going to go ahead and open up that SQL file that we created. And here we're going to run some commands just to show you guys that, hey, now we're just working with SQL Server. Now we're just working with the database. I'm going to select @version to get some version info, much like we would with SQL Server, but now you can see that this output, instead of where it would say Microsoft SQL Server and give you the version and the edition, now you can see it's SQL Azure, it's RTM. Now the funny thing is every time I run this it shows RTM. But what does change here is this date right here. Every time they do an update, this is what's going to get updated. You're not really going to change the version. Sometimes they change the version, but not much. And certainly the major version they'll announce a big release around that. But for the most part, this is one of those cases where things are getting updated behind the scenes for you. We can also look at some database properties and see that, oh, because I am in the wrong database. Change my database context. And now if we run this, there we go. So you can see I've got a standard edition, I've got my service tier, version, and size. So with that, let's just run one other thing. So I'm going to do a couple things here a little bit out of order. I'm going to go ahead and load a CSV, and we'll come back to that in the next demo. Now, to change the service level, we talked about the service level. Now, the nice thing about the cloud and the promise of flexibility is you aren't stuck with the service level that you used to create your database initially. So if at some point we wanted to change the service level, all I have to do is run a command. You can do this through the GUI, but I prefer the PowerShell because it's one line. I'm going to set Azure SQL Database, set my parameters, and I'm going to change my requested service level and service objective name to S1 from the current S0. Now this is going to take a few minutes to run, which is why I'm going to kick it back off now. We're going to come back to this. But the idea is that we can very easily change the size of our database and the feature set as needed, and we're very flexible with that. The cool thing about doing this is not going to disrupt my connection to the database. If there were any queries running, they would run fine. This is all behind the scenes and is non-invasive to the use of the database. So with that, I'm done with the first demo. Jason, do we have any questions so far?
Yeah, you got a couple more questions here. Are local variables and global variables, are local and global temporary tables available? There we go.
Are local and, okay. I believe you only have local because global is a server level thing, and we're going to talk here in a bit about that there really isn't a concept of this cross-database query interaction. There is, but it's a more advanced topic. In general, your databases are restricted to just the database. You're going to be working within the context of one database. So you can create, oh, wait, I'm sorry, I'm losing track there. You're talking about transferring temp tables between sessions, and I believe you can still do that.
Yep.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry,
and then,
I was off track.
Yeah, with the does the model database exist?
The model database might exist, but we're not aware of it. If you're looking to say, hey, I want to set certain configurations in the database so that every database I create on the server has certain objects in it, you don't really have that option by altering the model database. Your hands are off of that.
Right. And so the template for the databases comes from Microsoft, and there's not much we can do with it.
Exactly. This is back to that platform as a service thing. You're going to get kind of what they offer. However, I would highly recommend, if you're looking for that sort of setup, looking at some of Grant Fritchie or Steve Jones's talks on continuous integration and how that can be managed through source control.
Okay, and last one for the moment is, you can raise the service levels. Can you lower them as well?
Yes. Yes. All right. So let's jump back to, and that's it for the questions, Jason?
Yeah, that's it for now.
Okay, let's jump back to the slide deck. Got a couple things to talk about here. So we talked a little bit about we talked about how to create it, and we've seen some of this already. So the using of the Azure SQL Database, if we want to connect to it, like from our computer, it's very similar to connecting to just an on-premise server, right? We're going to give it a server name, and we can use, for the on-premise stuff, we can use Windows authentication or SQL authentication. Now with the Azure SQL Database, we're still going to be putting in the name of the SQL server in the connection string. We're just going to be using that database.database, your database name .database.windows.net. And we're limited to Azure AD authentication and SQL authentication. But otherwise, everything's going to connect to it the same way. You'll notice that in that demo, I was connecting using Management Studio. I wasn't using some strange Azure SQL Database tool. I wasn't going through the Azure portal. All your current tools are going to work because the connectivity libraries are all the same. You just need to put in the that server name for it. Now, what we get as far as features, like I said, the current version is 12, right? So we have this Azure SQL Database version 12. What does that mean as to what we can get? It typically, or in general, we get most of SQL Server's features, right? We get tables, we get indexes, we get all of that stuff. What's cool is we start to get some other 2016 features that have been added in. So things like row-level security and data masking. I know these are coming out with 2016 here, but they've been available in Azure SQL Database for, I think, a couple months at this point. The always encrypted features are available. We get other features as well. We can see that there were, with the premium level service offerings, we have in-memory OLTP. If you needed to use that with SQL 2014, they're baked into Azure SQL DB. We get in-memory column store, we get table partitioning, we get all these features. And in some ways, these features are also available in that standard edition offering. So while a lot of us struggle with saying, hey, I want these enterprise features, I'm running standard edition SQL Server and I can't really afford to go to enterprise edition, you can still go to a comparative price point in Azure SQL Database for your standard edition and get access to a lot of these features. Now some of them you don't. The in-memory OLTP, it's only available in premium. But then you can start to make some decisions about, well, this specific database needs in-memory OLTP, right? You're not restricted to saying the entire server has to have this feature set or not. You can say one database has in-memory OLTP and the other ones that don't need it, we're just not going to have at that service level. You also get some cloud-only features here. So the idea of, we understand what availability groups are, I think most people do, and the idea of high availability and disaster recovery. A lot of us will log ship to another data center. Sometimes we have mirroring or failover groups across data centers. So obviously within the cloud, where we don't have really access to the data centers, but we do understand the regions, we get these abilities of geo-replication and geo-restores. And very easily we have the ability to not just say, okay, well, I want to have my database fail over to another region, or we just restore it to another region. We can have the active geo-replication. We get a lot of options, and we don't have to buy any additional hardware. This is all kind of baked into the product offering and Microsoft's infrastructure. So right out of the bat, right out of the box, you get access to a lot of HADR stuff that you might have to really build out if you're using an on-premise product. Now there are unsupported things. It is a service, and we've talked a little bit about it. One of the things that isn't available is when we're talking about Azure SQL Database, we're talking about databases that are contained in and of themselves. While we have a server, it's not the same as if we had a server on-premise where all the databases are living with each other and can talk to one another. In Azure SQL Database, the different databases cannot actually communicate with each other without some additional work. And there's some stuff around that. It's a more advanced topic, and I'll be perfectly honest, it's not something I'm completely familiar with. I sort of understand how it works. No, one thing though is, another thing is we don't have server configuration. For all of you guys who are used to going in and tweaking TempDB and setting server level max stops and all that, that's gone. You don't have, in the one hand, you shouldn't have to worry about that. It's a service offering. You only care about the database. Microsoft will handle all of that on their end. And so that's, to me, the big advantage there. And again, because we're only working with databases, we should only worry about what's contained within there. Again, because we don't have the server level stuff, link servers are gone, kaput. Which, I'm sorry, I think that's great. I really feel bad if you have to use link servers at this point. But that's a personal preference, that's an opinion. However, in Azure SQL Database, since we're not working with server level objects, we don't have link servers. And so on and so forth, right? Resource governor, service broker, any sort of server level implementations, those are not going to be available to us. And if you want, I have included this link here to give you a full demonstration, or give you a full list, I'm sorry, of all the things that are not supported. So with that, just kind of talking generally about using and what's available to us. Any other questions so far, Jason?
Nope, no more questions yet.
All right, so let's go into the second demo where we're actually going to go in and use the Azure SQL Database a little bit. So we did go ahead and load the data, and I'm opening up the wrong window. Let's see here. There we go. So I loaded some demo data from a CSV. It's not much. It's about 200 some odd rows. But we can go in and query that table. So first of all, we can go into the object browser here, right? And we're going to see our table just like we saw it before. And we can actually, hey, let's script it out. Let's see what it looks like. I'm going to create it, script it out to a new query window. All stuff that we're used to using in Management Studio. And there's not a whole lot of difference here other than it takes a little bit for it to actually execute because we're going up to the internet there. There it goes. So it's scripted out my table now. It's a very simple table. It's all varchar 255 fields. But you know, whatever your objects are will get scripted out here like we're used to seeing. Now, remember, we changed the service level in this whole process, right? I opened this query window, and then we went back over and changed the service level, and we're back here. And you'll notice we didn't break connection. I'm going to query this, but we haven't, you know, normally if we had restarted SQL Server or something behind the scenes here, it would have broken the connection. We changed the service level, had no impact on our connection, and if we had been running any queries, those would have continued to run. Now, as you can see, I'm selecting, and the select response is fairly quick, right? Doesn't take too long. It's kind of what we would expect if we were running this with on-premise. So even while we're going over the wire, and we saw a little bit of latency when we went to script out the table object, there's really not any sort of latency with bringing back query results. Now, I'm going to go ahead and delete 10 rows from the table. And now we've selected that. Now let's say, for example, hey, I didn't want to delete those 10 rows. You know, normally in a situation like this, you know, we'd be going, okay, well, I got to go to my tapes, restore the database, copy it over. So this is where we come back to saying, hey, let's go ahead and I screwed up the demo, but that's all right. I can still show you the restore. I was supposed to capture the date before I did the restore, and I think I can still sort of do that. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and do a restore point in time. Let's actually do 2 add minutes minus 5. So we'll restore to 5 minutes ago while I was talking about the other stuff. So what we're going to do, like I said, this is where we say, okay, hey, you know, we accidentally deleted those 10 rows. We need to get those 10 rows back. How do we go about it? I'm going to go ahead and do a point-in-time restore. And to do this, I'm going to just use start Azure SQL Database Restore, you know, give it all the different parameters. Now, the one interesting thing about doing a database restore is I can't restore over a currently existing Azure SQL database. I can only restore alongside it. There's no like with replace function. So if you do a restore database T-SQL command, you can use with replace. Can't do that here. So I'm going to give it a different name, and again, I got to give it a point in time, and this is a PowerShell date time variable, and I'm just, I'm going to go ahead and restore it to my load date to 5 minutes ago. So we'll kick that off. Now the thing is, this is running behind the scenes. The restore is not complete. And this is one of the bits that I tend to struggle with a little bit around Azure SQL Database, is we can execute some of these commands like the resizing, the changing of the service level, and the restore, but we have no real control over how long that's going to take. And that's all dependent on Microsoft. So right now this is running. I have a loop script here to keep checking on it. I'm going to just run this. So the restore operation is going, oh hey, it's actually, yeah, it's still in progress. This is the one that it's running right now. This first one that came back. So that's running right now, and we're in the middle of a restore. The only way we really can reference that is using this commandlet. We can't actually, like, I can't open up, if I go into the object browser here and refresh this, like you'll see, I don't actually see the database that's being restored. It's all behind the scenes. So we're at its mercy to restore. And for me, I've seen this database and this demo takes, 3 to 5 minutes to restore. So we're not really going to wait on it. But what I want to talk to you about is we're going to have that database come up. And again, if we're in the scenario of trying to replace those 10 rows that we've just deleted, we have two options. We can either just copy the rows directly over, because we're going to have that database alongside the old database, which is the easy thing to do. Another thing that we can do, though, is we can actually drop and rename those databases. And they're just standard T-SQL commands. I've wrapped them up in using invoke SQL CMD because I wanted to make this the PowerShell script that I can just run for this. I like automating these things. But for swapping the databases, you'll see I'll run it from master, and I'm just going to run a drop database command, much like I would with an on-premise T-SQL. And then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to alter database, the copy that I restored, and just modify the name. And that will swap the name over. And that's just a way to juggle. We're just playing a shell game with the databases. There's nothing super magical about that. Now for the demo I have here to check the count again, let's just do a real quick check to see if our restore operation is still running. And it is still in progress. But for those of you who are wondering about, how easy is it to restore the database, it's actually pretty easy. Now you can go through the GUI. If you go into the portal, you can go to the particular blade and say, okay, well here's the database, and select the restore options and put your time in and all of that and execute it from there. It's totally fine and possible to do it through the GUI. I like the PowerShell because, again, it's one line for me. It's one line that I just have to execute, and we're done. We're off the races. So with that, any questions regarding how to access query from Azure SQL Database and how to do a restore?
No questions at the moment. The one question that actually had come through was regarding doing the restore from the GUI.
Okay. Yeah, so let's just we have a couple minutes here, so I'm going to pull up this. Now you're going to have to remember where this is, because I don't use the GUI that much if I don't have to. If we are in the, I feel bad for asking you, Jason. Do you know where in the portal we go here to do the GUI restore?
Offhand, I don't recall.
Right.
I think it's under creating new database where you're pointing at a restore file.
Yeah, I think if we go here to say add, let's see here. There is a way to do it through the GUI. I believe it's through Add Database, and as you said, Jason, you can select the database that you can restore from. Now, one of the gotchas here is it has to have been a database. If you're restoring a database through this, it has to be a database that, this isn't going to give us what we need, but it has to be a database that was on your server to begin with. It had to have been on your server at some point to restore. Now you can restore to a different server, but there had to have been an Azure SQL Database server that database lived on to do the restore from. To my knowledge, as of this point, you can't take a on-premise SQL Server backup. So like if you back up a database on your SQL 2014 server, to my knowledge, you cannot take that backup file and restore it to Azure SQL Database. So that's just one thing to be aware of. So with that, that's pretty much it for the presentation, going through the demos. I do want to just do the quick recap here. We went over what Azure SQL Database was and overall gave you the pieces and the parts. We showed you how to connect to it, how to query from it, how to restore it, do a little bit of table work, right? Obviously, we can do a lot more around that if we need to, but again, this is an introduction. This is scratching the surface, getting you started. So with that in mind, I'll just open it up for any more questions. If you're interested, this is my contact information, and this presentation slide deck and the script that is associated with it is available up there on, it's actually on my GitHub site. I need the updated version of my question slide that has the GitHub link, but if you go to github.com/Mike Fal altogether, M-I-K-E-F-A-L, you'll see a repository for my presentations, and this will be in there. Plus, I'll get it to Jason. I'm sure Jason can distribute it with the Cloud VC.
Yep, add it right into the meeting archive.
Excellent. So, like I said, I'm done. I'm open for questions. If anybody has anything else other than that, thank you very much for listening, guys.
Okay, we got one question here that hasn't been answered yet. How would you go about migrating an existing database to Azure SQL Database?
So, from like an on-premise database, I'm assuming. I guess the way that, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a bit tricky. Again, because I said you can't simply just back up an on-premise database and restore it to Azure. So what you're going to be looking at is some sort of logical backup and restore. Like, for example, you can use, so SQL Server has, with SSDT, the idea of what's called DAC packs, data tier application stuff, which you can store the database as a Visual Studio project. And this gives you all the scripts for the objects and whatnot. Well, there's another version of that called a backpack, B-A-C-P-A-C. And what it does is it saves that schema, but it also saves all the data as a bunch of insert statements of inserting the data in a logical fashion. Another way to do it would be to ETL your data, to use the database copy wizard where it would just create a bunch of SSIS packages and pump your data up. But there's no simple, hey, I'm just going to back up and then restore up to Azure SQL Database. It will take a little bit of work to get an existing database up there.
All right, that's the only outstanding questions we have. Thanks everyone for attending here today. And we'll get the slide deck and the video posted, and we've got a few more presentations coming up in the next few weeks. So thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for attending.